Hi, folks. I'm John Chrastka, Executive Director for EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute. It's very nice to be with you today for another one of our training programs for the Utah State Library. This one is Understanding Constituents and Audiences. It's the second in our 2022-2023 series. The one track for this program is set up to help support trustees and boards. Let me get this video out of your way, called Creating More Effective Boards. This one is part of our more staff-focused series on marketing to build support. The work that we're doing is not only here on video, but we're also with these pre-recorded webinars, but we're also doing coaching calls, and also we're available anytime for one-on-one consultations with library leaders across the state. But our next coaching call is October 25th at 10 a.m. Mountain. The state library will be sending out information about how you can log in. As always, the presentations are being done by the EveryLibrary Institute, which is the 501c3 nonprofit organization. It's a public policy, tax policy, education policy think tank for libraries. We do a tremendous amount of training programs for state libraries and for state library associations around the country in a wide variety of topics, generally focused on the funding formula for libraries, some about advocacy, some about activism, some about fundraising. And it's a real pleasure to be able to check in with you folks today on this marketing to build support track in particular. So I'm going to minimize my screen here so that I'm not in your way too much. And I want to get into the conversation with you. Again, with an eye towards what can we be doing also on our coaching calls later on in October. I'm going to take you through a little bit of theory first. If you were on the other session, this might be a little bit familiar, which is good. But we're going to start almost every one of our programs with some conversation about the theory of advocacy and the theory of activism, mainly because the two modes of getting things done have been conflated over the years, and they've been mushed together to such a point where I think we have real trouble inside libraries to figure out what we're doing. Advocacy and activism are fundamentally related to each other, but they are different ways, different modes of behavior, and knowing the differences between them is very important. Our theory of advocacy here at the EveryLibrary Institute and EveryLibrary, our political action committee side, is that advocacy is about co-creating a future with a funding partner or a programmatic partner that has some sort of opportunity for substantial change in either the funding formula or the policy framework that you're doing library work within. It is not adversarial. Advocacy is about co-creation. Activism is sometimes adversarial because there's a problem you're trying to avert or an opportunity you're trying to seize. But advocacy itself is about helping to come up with a good idea together when you get right down to it. It does start with a bit of rational ignorance on the part of the counterpart that you're looking to advocate with or advocate to. It might be an elected official, it might be a funder, it might be a grant maker, but in the main, nobody knows as much about what you do as you do. Education and orientation about the capabilities and capacities of libraries and who librarians and library workers are today is the foundational structure for advocacy campaigns. It always has been, and sometimes we forget to do it. The rational actor on the other side of the conversation is certainly capable of co-creating a future where there's proper funding or a new authority to act, to get things done together, but they are a rational actor who might be rationally ignorant of what you do. And it's up to us to spend time with them in advance of the conversation even to support their understanding of who we are, what we do, what we're capable of. Then you can move in advocacy work to ideation around what a shared solution to problems could look like, what a shared solution to problems should look like. When I say problems, I mean fundable activities that address problems, authority to act to address problems, alignments that allow you to put your resources, your expertise to work. So how can we fix a problem together with a funding partner, with a programmatic partner? That co-creation, that ideation step moves into then identifying what resources we need in order to collaborate authentically. And resources are either people, their good name, their money. So what do we need in order to move this idea about a solution to a problem forward? Let's identify those resources that both parties or multiple parties bring to it. And then let's get activated around doing it This is not this is sometimes a political activation. Sometimes it's social. Sometimes it's very strategic. Other times it's tactical. Depends on what you're looking for. But the commitment within an advocacy framework is to then build the systems that you need, whether it's policy, legislation, funding, grant programs, structured financing, that moves you forward. It's different than activism in substantial ways. Activism is not a long game; it's a short game. It's about seizing opportunities. It's about averting crises. It's about nudging the asteroid sometimes before it hits. And it is a self-interested opportunity for us as librarians and library workers and library staff, because activism is necessary sometimes to preserve, protect, defend our role in society, our institutions. Activism is based on belief systems as much as advocacy is. Activism is based on identity as well. Who do we want to be? How do we want to respond? And I'm going to touch on some of these issues as we proceed through today's session, but focusing more on advocacy than activism, but I owe you this good explanation. Activism is, in and of itself, something that has integrity, that its motivations are honest, its goals are authentic, because otherwise folks will not stay with you in an activism campaign. Activism directs activity rather than allowing for co-creation. There's a lot of people who show up to an activism conversation and say, John, tell me what to do. I'm not sure what to do. John, you've been paying a lot more attention to this than I have. What should I be doing? Activists say, do this thing, take this action, attend this meeting, do this particular thing, and we will help either change the world or save the world together. And activism is focused on organizing the support base and helping activists move from small successes to larger ones. Incremental growth as an activist is a key component of helping the constituents within the activism space grow is a key part of the theory of successful activism. And I bring those two things up not to beat a dead horse. If you watch this last one, you know where it goes. Where we're looking to spend some time here on this conversation around identifying the audiences and the constituents is intended for you to slot in your audience conversations into either one of those two situations, either a long-term advocacy play where you're co-creating a future, or a short-term activism situation where you've got to do something to seize opportunity, or again, nudge that asteroid. Now, nothing happens in libraries around funding or your authority to act without there being a firm understanding of the political frames around what you're doing. And whether you want to suggest to me that libraries are neutral or apolitical, that's cool, I get it, but you're taxpayer funded. And if you're in the tax code, and if you're in the structure of your city or your county or your town or around the country in different ways as independent districts, we have to understand some of the politics of what's going on here as we look at constituents and audiences, especially. The political decisions that are made are an expression of a value system. They're an expression of a value system around how do we choose to tax ourselves? How do we want to put money to work expressing our values? There are political idioms that are very active. Progressive ones that say we should be taxing ourselves to fund the common good. Conservative ones that might be more about limited government, but still a posture of taking care. Libertarian ones that are looking to lower barriers and make sure the government stays out of our way. But in all three of those different political idioms, the politics that is, the polity that we do is expressed in the politics of how we want to fund libraries, how we want to do collection development, how we even want to respond to book bans and challenges. Let me take you through some of the civic and social and voter attitudes around libraries right now. And again, if you saw the first one, this is a little bit of a deeper dive. The civic and social attitudes are really what defines how audiences and how constituencies behave at their ground state. It's important to know that to take a look at the difference between civic attitudes and voter attitudes, however, because your civic attitudes, that's where your audiences live, and your voter attitudes is where your constituents of elected officials live. Civic attitudes, in the main, are focused on liking libraries. This is a slightly older data set from Pew, but it's been affirmed time and time and time again, even during COVID, even coming through COVID, and so many of the disruptions that we've been experiencing. The majority of Americans do hold very positive views about libraries. And that's a very important thing to remember in a time of some unrest and certainly of some disruption for our sector. Depending on where you are in the state of Utah, where I am in suburban Chicago, the fact that the majority of Americans are quiet about their support for libraries is something that we need to be working on. Because if we can't bring out folks who are, well, good enough with us, happy enough with us, okay enough with us, in fact, even favorably disposed to us, we are going to be seeing a deeper and deeper erosion of our ability to serve, because our funding is tied to political support by those people who are positive about us, but might not necessarily be vocal in their support. It's interesting to note that what people think libraries do is different than what people use libraries for. And again, this is Pew 2016, but the confirmation of this in surveys from ALA and OCLC, Urban Libraries Council, EveryLibrary, us as well. Folks look at what libraries do as a very noble situation. That you're providing safe places, that you're providing educational opportunities for all, you're sparking creativity, you're doing a sense of community, you're helping people decide on the information they can trust. And this is all what people think you do for other people, which is great because it's true, and you do some of this. But what people use libraries for in the main, your singular audience of users versus non-users is a lot more prosaic. People use the library, and the library audience is really divided into two spheres, users and non-users. They are, at the beginning of the conversation, either accessing what you're doing or not. And nowhere in this presentation today will you hear me talking about turning people from non-users into users. I'm looking to reach your audiences and your constituents where they're at. But in the main, what people want to do at the library, and this is 2016, this is pre-pandemic, this is pre-Trump, this is pre a lot of things, and it's still the same today. And I want to show this to you because the insights that Pew has into how do you talk to folks are pretty significant with that 2016 sample. But people really come to the library in the main, not to do those noble things that they think you do for other people. They come there to get their stuff, to borrow books, to watch, to read, to hang out, maybe to get some help, which is really nice. And then a diminishing portion of them are using you for the programs, the services, which are great. And they're very important for smaller groups and specialized groups. But in the main, what Americans do when they come to the library is that they borrow or use your stuff. And yet, there's a great deal of compassion that people have for other humans when it comes to the library. Pew in 2016, and this is a salient point here, which is why I'm sitting with the Pew data instead of a more recent data set, because nobody else has asked this one quite the same way except for Pew. And if everything else in Pew is holding up, I got to believe this is too. There's a lot of folks in this country and in your neck of the woods and my neck of the woods who, when you ask them, should we close the library? They'll say no, because it will have a major negative impact on their community, or even a minor negative impact on their community. Heck, there's only 6% of people in this survey back in 2016, and I think it's got to be around 8% now. So there wouldn't be any impact at all. Most Americans, over 90% of Americans, think that there will be some negative impact on their community if the library closed. And only 33% think it would be a significant negative impact on themselves. 66%, some impact. But there's a full third of Americans out there who are like, don't worry about me, I'm fine. And in fact, the middle group about minor impact is probably like, yeah, well, don't worry about me, I'm fine. there's a tremendous amount of compassion for the other in the audiences that we're talking to. This cuts across users, it cuts across non-users. It cuts across every demographic point, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, household income, educational attainment. Folks in the main, in the United States of America, in your neck of the woods and mine, want to see the library present to do good things. They want to see the library open in order for it to do good things. And in the meantime, they're going to come in and they're going to do their own stuff, which means that your audiences from the beginning of any conversation we have about trying to position you differently for funding or for the authority to act, when we're trying to position you differently amongst your audiences and the constituents of elected officials, the thing we have to remember is that there's very few people, relatively speaking, who have a self-interest in what you're describing. First off, from the utilization of it, mostly they just want their books and their stuff, and from the compassion conversation. Most people are not in it for themselves. I'm okay, don't worry about me. But they're in it for but for the grace of God go I. Your audiences want to hear the stories that you're telling about those kinds of compassionate and transformational things, and how you put the good, a small amount of smart taxpayer money to good work. All right, let's keep going on what this looks like here, because your audience and your constituencies, again, I mentioned there's civic, there's also the voter side of things. Across the two surveys in 2008 and 2018, OCLC produced the From Awareness to Funding study. In 2018, they asked the same questions as they did in 2008. 2018, they asked, if the XYZ public library is on the ballot, will you vote for it or not? And what they found was 27% of Americans were definitely going to vote yes for the library. They form the core of the library party in the United States. 27% of Americans are going to vote yes for the library just by reading the ballot language, which is fantastic. It's also not 50% plus one that you need to pass something in almost every place except for California, where you need 66.7%. Another 31% of American voters will likely vote for the library if they're given an opportunity to understand what's going on. Another 42%, though, are softer than that. Well, about half, 21%, are likely to vote no, which is fascinating to me. And it's largely because they're suspicious of where their taxes have been going in the past, not about the library, but about your city council, county government, what's happening in the state capitol, what's happening in Washington, D.C. They're suspicious people about bureaucracies and government. And there's another 21%, and this is a national sample, who are definitely going to vote no for the library taxes, but they're also going to vote no for a lot of other taxes also. Any tax is a bad tax. They are deeply against new tax measures until we figure this whole thing out again. They are not going to come around. And understanding from an audience perspective that what OCLC discovered about, what drives somebody to be a believer is not their demographics. 27% who vote yes are not demographically different than the 21% who are likely to vote no, or the 31% who are likely to vote yes. Race, ethnicity, gender, household income, educational attainment are not key drivers, nor is the use of the library a key driver across any of these different types of audiences, these different types of constituents, these different pools of voters, which is shocking in a certain respect. And we've known this now for several years, and yet we are behaving in a lot of ways as if what motivates people on election day is some sort of self-interest, which it's not. It's a compassionate conversation, or there's some issues around pride of place as well that I want to get into in a moment or two. But we're trying to figure out all the time, we're trying to handicap whether or not, if we talk to moms, or if we talk to dads, or if we talk to grandparents, or if we talk to white women over the age of 24 with a high school education, that we're somehow going to break through, when this matrix here is a belief. It's a belief about a couple key things: the transformational nature of library work and the powerful role that librarians have in doing the work. It's the core question being answered on election day that every voter has, which is, tell me where my money is going to go and tell me who's going to spend my money. All right, there we go. Interesting to note, there's been a fall off. This was pre-COVID, and we're not sure exactly where this is right now. We're working on that as EveryLibrary, trying to do some more polling work. And it's something that we want to talk to you about as you're looking at segmenting your messaging and your audience across those believers, those questioners, and those suspicious voters more accurately. If you're going to be going out for new tax revenue, about how we can help you do better polling yourself or better survey work yourself. But what we've seen nationally, again, this is OCLC's data, the 2008 to 2018 comparisons, there's been a fall off. There's been a pretty significant fall off in the total population that always loved the library. The 27% the voter population that always loved the library. It's fallen on that super supporter side by about 0.6%, which is significant in that percentage size. And it's fallen by almost 7 basis points amongst probable supporters. The segment of people who will vote yes for the library is down significantly within those areas. And I think it has a lot more to do with the fact that people are consumers than the fact that they are library supporters. They're politically active. We're talking about voters here. They're politically active and they're upset by where things are going in this country. We've seen it with the rise of the Tea Party. We've seen it with different activities around the elections, this past election cycle in particular. We're seeing it right now with conversations that are happening, sometimes very disrupted conversations about books, the content of books, the stories that are being told in those books. What's interesting to note is that the user patterns, at least 2008 to 2018, didn't change that much amongst the super supporters, our core group. There was some erosion over the decade between 08 and 18, and we've seen it through the pandemic now also amongst folks who may be a little softer in their support, more likely to support. And that is an area of interest for us here at EveryLibrary. And how do we help rebuild some of the familiarity that people have with what we're up to? What's interesting is that the positivity rate over that decade did not fall. In fact, it grew amongst some folks. And what did fall is the percentage of people who rated librarians positively. Again, not among those super supporters. They love you. They are either in touch with you or are they nostalgic about you. But the probable supporters are starting to lose touch with librarians, not the institution. Again, what does not matter, according to OCLC and the From Awareness to Funding study in 2008 and in 2018, political party doesn't matter in that stratification between believers, questioners, and suspicious voters, and even the never going to vote for you nevers. A card-carrying member of an anti-tax organization is never going to vote for you. At least we know where they sit. But across the other 3 major buckets, Republican, Democrat, Independent, mainstream, no stratification. The user status of the voter doesn't matter. In fact, there's a lot of libraries out there, and you know this as staff, there's a lot of libraries out there who have people who are never going to vote for you, who spend a lot of time at the library working on their political manifestos, and they want you to even read it and proof it for them. But they're power users who are not going to vote in your favor. Likewise, the library serves a lot of people as active users who are not politically or civically enfranchised. They're not participating in society. They're an audience perhaps of users, but they're not an audience of supporters because they lack either political voice, acumen, or agency. And yet they're the ones who benefit most from the transformational work that you do. And there's nothing in the data about cardholder rates influencing levels of support for libraries amongst voters, either as constituents of elected officials or as direct electors themselves. What does matter is that believers believe. The folks in that 27% who are like, yep, I believe in the library. What do you got? What do you want me to do? In fact, the believers believe is so powerful that when there are certain opposition groups around the country during October of 2022, when we're recording this, who are running vote campaigns against the library. There's one in Jonesboro, Arkansas, that would, if it passes, would defund the library by 50%. The way it's phrased is that you vote yes, you defund the library. The campaign that's working out against that right now is very concerned because the first 25–30% of the voters are going to vote yes for the library because they read the word library on the ballot. Believers believe, and they would like to have, as an audience, their belief system affirmed, their belief system validated, their belief system demonstrated back to them. In fact, there's an audience here of believers about what libraries do and who librarians are that look at you so strongly as, well, if it's about compassion, if it's about building a more just community, a stronger community, a more vibrant community, you, as the people who work at the library, whether you're a librarian or a library staff member, frontline, whatever, all y'all are a proxy for their compassion. You're doing something that they believe in very strongly, and they would like to see you at work. They would like to see you as an audience. They want to see you validating their belief systems by the work that you're doing. They want to hear from you about it. They're an audience of eager listeners. And they're the strongest possible supporters that you've got. They're the library party of the United States. They're the library party of your hometown. There's another audience out here that OCLC has taught us about, which is that questioners, they want answers. They want to have the answer to where's my money going to go and who's going to spend my money. They want to know where's the money going to go and who's going to spend their money for people based on their competencies and their integrities. The institution that they have some trust in already. They're an audience that wants to have their questions that they will never vocalize answered by the people who are doing the work. And they would like to have the dots connected for them. They're an audience of listeners who want to know what's going to happen if they give you the funding. There's a third group that what really matters are these suspicious voters. What moves people, what moves the big conversations and communities forward is when the believers are more than a special interest group, and the questioners are more than a plurality alongside the believers. It's when the suspicious people are not suspicious of the library and aren't looking at the librarians with side eye. These are a group of constituents of yours. This is an audience segment that wants to hear not the nice stories like the believers, and not the heavily detailed stories like the questioners, but they're a group of people who want to hear about what happens if you don't do the work. If you don't get the funding, what happens if we don't? What's plan B? How about we don't spend the money this time? You have to be able to show up to the suspicious people, the suspicious voters, this audience segment that is looking at you askance, and tell them the deep, deep truth about not just where the money's going to go and not just representing yourself as the group who's spending the money, but what happens if you're unable to affect change. Now, I'm going to get into this in a few more minutes about messaging across all three of these areas, especially around the suspicious side of things, because understanding some of the nuances to each of these audiences, what are they truly in love with that you do? What groups or what parts of the community do they truly focus on more deeply is more nuanced than just these three top line audiences, these three top line groups of constituents. But this is where we start. And across all three of these, I want to bring something up that's very important, is that the image of the librarian matters a great deal to them. Well, the believers want to think of you as a proxy for their compassion. The questioners want to know who's going to spend the money. And the suspicious voters need to hear about it from someone they trust instead of some bureaucrat or politician trying to pull a fast one on them. Nothing impacts voter behavior more than their perception of the librarian. The library as an institution is fundamentally core to what motivates a believer. I'm sorry, what motivates a voter or a constituent of elected official. Nothing is more important than perception, not use, not demographics. How do we feel about, where's our value system pointing? All right. There's some softness to this issue around the image of the librarian, though, that I do think we need to spend some time on. It's a hard one to talk about because enthusiasm about library staff fell before the pandemic, when people could come into the library and see you at work. During the pandemic, I'm not sure where we're at right now. And as we're coming out of the pandemic in October of 2022 and getting back up into regular mode, we have to do some good polling as an industry, and every library is working on it, to find out what this enthusiasm is right now for the people who are spending the taxpayer money, who are the grant maker, I'm sorry, the grant partner. They're the beneficiary of a philanthropist or a donor. Fundamentally, it's not the institution, it's the individuals. We have to be very cognizant when we're talking about audiences that they can hear from us as storytellers and as enactors of their value system. And right now, it's soft in a lot of places around the country. If it's robust where you are right now in Utah, in your little corner of the woods, great. And let's keep an eye on holding it there. If it's not, and your numbers are mirroring more about the national numbers than you'd like to admit, we need to work on ways to get your staff out of the building in front of these audiences before you start doing anything to start moving these audiences forward with your messaging. They have to believe the messenger before any of your messaging is going to stick. All right, let's talk for a few minutes about talking with humans. And what are we going to talk with humans about? Other humans, not just, librarian humans, not just library people, but the humans out there in your community and in my community. We're going to talk to them about ideals and ideas. We're going to talk to them about, and we're going to discover as we're talking to them about these ideals, an ideal like literacy services, like do we have universal literacy services in our community? An ideal like support for people when they're looking for their first, next, or best job. An ideal like everybody should get a hand up instead of a hand out from society, and the library is the first place for the hand up. An ideal like we should be a place that is interesting to live in, and so our programming is going to be interesting. We should be a thriving place to live, so we're going to do stuff like health and well-being. That we are going to be part of the education matrix before school, after school, and out of school. Each of those different ideals has a different audience segment, but they're wired in a couple different ways. And I'd like to describe how people are wired, how humans are wired to listen to you, before we start getting into message segmentation and understanding where the appeals need to be. Here's some more political theory for you folks. All right, we talked about politics before, and if you saw the first of these coaching calls, I spent a lot more time on this than one slide, and I invite you to go back and check it out. But there are three mainstream political narratives in this country that people filter through a conversation about something as idealistic as literacy services or support for the unemployed, support for people in moments of transition and crisis, or something like the hand up instead of the hand out. These three different mainstream political philosophies are all capable of taxing ourselves to fund the common good. They're not the kind of disruptor, burn it all down folks that are out there looking to break society. They're looking to build society with community anchor institutions as part of the mix. The progressive ideals. There's a hero narrative and a villain narrative. And forgive me, The Three Languages of Politics here is a great book. If you look up Three Languages of Politics, forgive me, I should have put on the slide, Arnold Kling, K-L-I-N-G. It'll be in your worksheets. He gives a lot more of a deep argument or discussion of these three different approaches. What he says is that everyone has a hero narrative and everyone has a villain narrative to describe their own identities as progressives, conservatives, or libertarians. The hero narrative for a progressive, according to Mr. Kling, is that they support the underprivileged. So we look at ourselves as progressives and say, we are good people because we put a small amount of smart tax money to work on the common good. Villains to the progressive are those people who disregard, harm, otherwise downtrodden, the downtrodden. And to a progressive, a villainous organization or a villainous individual is somebody who has a coarse disregard even for those people who need the help. What kind of people do we want to be? How do we want to take care of our neighbors? On the conservative side, the hero narrative, according to Mr. Kling, is that the conservatives are people who stood up for Western values. And there are times where the barbarians at the gate is the villain narrative. How do we look like? Conservatives want to make sure in a political space that the good money is not going after weird things or bad things or things that somehow or another are disruptive to our core ideals. It's important to recognize this because there are times when progressives and conservatives fight with each other over something as basic as the dignity of the individual, because we look at each other more as villains than respecting each other's hero narratives. The audiences between progressives and conservatives are very different audiences. Even though they might be believers themselves, they might show up as a believer to the library because of your progressive ideals. They might show up as a believer to the library because it's a community anchor institution that predates the founding of the state. That the work that's being done to stabilize society through the library and expand and extend our common approach to the common weal is a conservative ideal. And if we are accidentally in opposition to that, we do look barbaric. And it is very difficult to reset that if we are casually ourselves disregarding the conservative idioms. The third mainstream political philosophy, according to Mr. Kling, is the libertarian one. The libertarian one where the role of taxes gets in the way. It's the folks who are socially liberal but fiscally conservative, and actually might be in truth instead of just rhetorically. The hero to the libertarian is somebody who wants to lower barriers to participation in society and even lower barriers for people to achieve their own ideals regardless of society. And the villains in a libertarian environment are folks who are, well, they're overreaching. The villain is someone who, to a libertarian, is putting up too much regulation. There's this wasted tax money. There's opacity to how money is being spent. Folks, the library community is in real need of new allies in that libertarian approach to things. The small amount of smart tax money. The idea that fees and fines are perhaps overreach and that we need to lower barriers by removing some of those things that are in people's ways, and that the libertarian who is not who is still interested in the furtherance of society can look at the cooperative nature of purchasing, as long as it's framed properly, as being one of the best ways to leverage the common benefits of society. Those three audiences, those three mindsets, don't supersede believers, questioners, and suspicious voters. They're commingled across believers, suspicious voters, and questioners. You've got those political persuasions across all three of those. So as we're looking to talk about our audiences, understanding where mindsets are, as well as their dispositions about how they want to spend their tax money and how they want to organize society. There's another set of reasons that people will support an ideal, something as idealistic as literacy services or support for people looking for work or moments of transition of crisis, or the built environment of a community anchor institution in the middle of the 21st century. Around politics, and this is from a good book called The Political Brain by a fellow named Drew Weston. If we're looking at constituents of elected officials, we're looking at constituents of parties, we're looking at folks who are civically engaged in pretty deep ways. The reasons that they are engaged is because of the party or the candidate or the campaign itself, the ideals, the mission and vision. It's based on a shared value system, first and foremost, and then a shared identity around, are we the people who get this thing done because the campaign or the candidate is representing them in some legitimate ways. It's important to recognize this as a factor of our audience identification. And I'm not talking about party politics or tribalism, but there is a lot to be said for having audiences, an understanding of our audiences, where we know whether or not they are closely aligned or remotely aligned to us based on our value system and our identity. The believers, they most likely have a value system that's highly aligned with ours, and they have an identity already. I mentioned that the Library Party of the United States, the Library Party of your part of Utah and my part of Illinois. It's the believers that I'm less worried about here than the questioners. The questioners are people who have a value system that is civically, socially, politically aligned with being involved. But they're not necessarily, well, a believer, you're top 5 for them on the value system. You're a top 5 issue, the library is. And you, as library workers and librarians, are a proxy for their compassion. They put a lot of identity in you. Questioners are like into something that's library aligned, but they have values and they have an identity. They have values that are maybe around, how do we take care of people? How do we build community? Maybe that they are aligned around the future of education, but more as parents who do sports or band or theater, rather than the parents of the parents who are focused on learning as such, or the reading club. Nothing wrong with that. The value system that you have is about the whole life of the child. And right now, the identities are split. And to move people into closer identification with the library means that you have to identify for them. And this is that advocacy conversation. You have to identify for them how what you're doing is representing their interests also. The whole life of the child, before school, after school, and out of school. Whether it's sports or arts or reading or discovery or learning or band, across all these different groups, we can come together with a shared identity because our value system is very closely aligned already. This is important theory work for audience identification, because it's not we got to get the band parents to like the library. We've got to get the library into a position as being seen by the band parents as being in a common concern for those kids, or a common cause for the issues that are being addressed. Okay, there are 4 basic tones, if you will, to how people listen to an idea. Something as basic as literacy services or help for people in moments of transition or crisis, or investing in community anchor institutions. I mentioned earlier how many of the believers in the library space are, and across the spectrum, there's that understanding of compassion driving why people support the library. That's beautiful. And it's not necessarily operative in every case, and it's not necessarily the key driver for political decision making across all the different audience perspectives, the tones of the audience. But compassion is a key driver, and I wouldn't shy away from it one bit. And I would talk about how you yourselves, as the library leadership team and your library staff and the board and the volunteers and the funding community, put compassion to work every day. But there's a number of people, especially amongst those suspicious voters, while they are compassionate, they truly care about other human beings. Otherwise, they wouldn't be civically involved. Their intersection point with the library is more about infrastructure and pride of place than it is about compassion at its core, because there's a lot of groups out there that are compassionate, but how do we build community? How do we make places more interesting, thriving, and prosperous? These are two very different ways to talk to very different audiences. Because if your audience is a compassionate audience and you're talking about infrastructure, you sound cold-hearted. If your audience is about infrastructure and pride of place, and you start talking about compassion, you sound like a bleeding heart. And I want you to be aware of these things as you're building out your messaging environment, because the audience, the way that they filter, the way that they listen, the way that they care, their lens, their tone matters. Because otherwise, you're not doing audience segmentation. You're just doing sort of talking point development. There's a third group, a third grouping of how people are wired to care, and that's when they have a data lens to it. They want to be care-filled. They want to be compassionate. Don't get me wrong, they are. But their lens at the beginning is whether or not the work that's being done, the work that's being proposed, it will actually deliver any results. The compassionate people hope for results. The pride of place people build towards results, but the data that shows it, audience, they need to be demonstrated too, that you've got some evidence that if you do a certain kind of project, it's been proven either by you someplace previously, or it's been proven by another library someplace previously, or it's been proven by education or parks or the arts someplace previously. Because if there's no data supporting it, they can't get to compassion, they can't get to pride. And again, there's a big difference in these audiences, because if you start a story about where you want to go with the library to a data-driven person with bleeding heart compassion or cold-hearted pride or steely-eyed pride around infrastructure, you're going to be not taken, you're not going to be taken seriously. And I don't want your good messaging to fall upon deaf ears when the audience wants to know, can you prove it? Can we find some data and tell me if this is going to work or not? And then there's a fourth group of people out in the world, and these are even across believers sometimes right now, because it's a crisis response situation, but it's certainly across questioners and across suspicious voters who are concerned themselves about what's going on in society right now, coming through COVID, what's happening on the political side of things. They have real legitimate concerns. And this audience segment, if you do not address their concerns with appropriate gravity, with appropriate seriousness, and you will be seen as being flippant and or naive, and they won't listen to you. It's not that you score any points, folks, going across all four of these properly and planning your audience segmentation appropriately and your messaging across these different nuances of the audience, but you will lose points, especially around the concern or fear-filled, if you are appearing to be wearing rose-colored glasses. Okay, one more thing about political theory here and about human nature. That is fundamentally that people are wired in one of four ways to be supporters. It's proximity. It's almost like a bullseye. At the center of the bullseye for any idea or ideal, it's the relational supporters. It's the people who know something about libraries and librarians. This is an audience segment as well. The relational supporter is somebody who's inside. You have to treat them like an insider, whether they're a user or not. You have to work with them in order to put their relationships to work for the goals that you're looking to accomplish. If you turn your back on them or you take them for granted, you will have difficulties. Because relational supporters are idealistically aligned with what you're doing. And they have a sense of ownership over, well, maybe the library in a negative way, but certainly over the shared mission, the common vision, and the value system. They're wonderful people, and there's not that many of them. The next ring out are ideological supporters of an issue. And I'm talking here about any issue. I'm talking about Greenpeace. I'm talking about Second Amendment. I'm talking about ideologically aligned around minimum wage or reproductive issues. Anything in the political space, including libraries and the work that you do, ideologically, they can be aligned with who you are and what you're up to. Because, again, going back to the parents of students thing, they're ideologically aligned around the whole life of the child. Going back to economic development, they're aligned around a thriving and prosperous community. Going back to taking care of seniors, they're aligned around well-being, but they might not know what you've got going on. So the fact that they are not relational supporters is fine. They don't have to have that deep and abiding relationship as an audience with you, but you have to be able to talk to them along the lines of what's your shared mission, what's your shared value system, and to connect dots for them. A lot of believers live in relational, but not all of them. A lot of questioners live in ideological supporters. They can be aligned if you can help make the alignments happen to that audience. Generally speaking, relational supporters and ideological supporters are the ones who will participate in an advocacy campaign over the long term. They're there with you for the long haul. They were there from the beginning. If they're relational supporters, they come around and they stay with you because what you're talking about with new resources for your library, new programs, new services, new staffing, etc., is a way to realize a shared ideological approach to solving the problems in society. The next ring out here of aversionary supporters is important to understand because they are more activism oriented, which is cool. I get it. Because they are the type of political activist, social activist who wants to see good things happen and not throwing good money after bad. Not like, why are we screwing this up this time? What are we doing right now? Are they at it again? Like they are folks who are activatable based on, well, sometimes it's truly based on things aren't going well and I want to fix it. These are not people who are involved in long-term advocacy campaigns. This audience is not looking for a 3-year strategic plan. They want to be informed, educated, empowered, and activated to get something done. And that audience is a legitimate audience because when crisis happens, we need a response. And when opportunity is presented to us, either from a legislative perspective or a new money available or a grant program we weren't expecting or a beneficiary shows up, we do need those people to be aligned with us in order to help move that conversation forward. Then the fourth audience, the fourth motivational factor here are people who are motivated by access around the ideals. They're people who are in politics looking for that $10,000 plate dinner so they can go get their picture taken with the candidate or the president. We don't have a lot of those in libraries, but that's cool because what we do have are people who want to be acknowledged for their support of the library. It's the people who want to put the yard sign about a library champion lives here. It's the folks who like to wear a button or put a bumper sticker on their car. They are good supporters of the library, but they are not deep necessarily supporters of the library. I'm not saying everybody who gets a bumper sticker is a shallow supporter. That's false. They could be a relational supporter who likes putting the bumper sticker on. They could be an ideological supporter who likes the bumper sticker. They could be a aversionary supporter who likes a bumper sticker, but they just like doing bumper stickers. That's perfectly cool because we would like to bring as many of those people along. But if you're looking for more sustainable or for more strident advocacy or activism, you're going to need to look to different types of supporters first. All right, those were about humans. Let's shift gears, please, and talk about organizations themselves and agencies and stakeholder groups, the infrastructure of society that are, well, I mean, like the other parts of the way that your town, your county, your state, our country are organized. The infrastructure of community-based organizations, governmental groups, nonprofits, clubs, communities of intention, etc. Because we need to be able to understand how our audiences, in the main, are organized outside of the library communities. The rest of the infrastructure of our society is pretty vast, and our interface points with them as different audiences for our conversations have to be properly understood. So what am I talking about? Great. There's 7 different, generally speaking, segments to our audience who are in need of hearing from us in audience-specific ways. All the different overlays I've described so far, if we look at it as almost like a matrix, there's the believers, the questioners, and the suspicious voters. There's people who are motivated by compassion or pride or data or have concerns or are fear-filled. We've got people who are closer to you ideologically or closer to the issues when it comes to being an aversionary supporter or closer to a relational matrix, a relational disposition about identification with you. There are all these different permutations across politics, progressives, conservatives, libertarians, and each of these different 7 other groups. If I was to put this up for another organization, I put library stakeholders on here. This is our point of interface to get anything done in our society. Because in the main, if someone is civically involved, if someone is socially involved, if someone is involved enough to be a voter or a volunteer or an elected official or a board member or puts in that kind of time or treasure as a donor, they're going to shake out across probably these different networks. All right, let's talk about them. Educational partners. Our folks is an audience, I should say. Educational stakeholders who have a disposition to listen to you, your ideas, your proposals, your funding requests, your partnership overtures. They have a disposition to listen to you because they are on the line of who else cares about education. Who else cares about education is broader than just the schools, though. And I'm going to take you through all 7 of these real quick about who they are, and then we're going to get into like how do we make some assumptions about what they want to talk about with us, and how do we approach these audiences with our particular messaging. So, landscape, educational partners, level setting. We're talking about organizations, agencies, and stakeholder groups that are both formal and informal that cover the waterfront between pre-K, K-12, the out-of-school, after-school, before-school matrix. The folks who care not just about college, but about career. The social welfare and religious groups, which are themselves potentially partners of yours. There's certainly audiences and constituencies that are outside of the library, but care about the same populations you do. These organizations, agencies, and stakeholder groups run other parts of society that have a lot of overlap with libraries. It might be a counseling center or food pantry. It might be job training or literacy. It certainly is youth-oriented. It's certainly human services. And the reason I put social welfare and as well as religious stakeholders in here is because the religious side of things runs a lot, faith-based organizations run a lot of society. And again, libraries are aligned either ideologically around problem solving, or they're aligned relationally because we've got some sort of common identity. Another audience that you're going to be dealing with all the time, and this is from a marketing outreach power building perspective, is governmental partners. It's the folks who are elected or appointed civil service officials. It's your Parks and Rec, your public safety, your public works. And the reason I want to look at them individually here as an audience and a group that you have to understand is because they can sometimes look at you in a very competitive way, or there might be overlapping services. And they're in the tax base the same way you are, which is different than a social services organization or religious organization that might be a nonprofit. Another audience that you're going to be dealing with all the time, and they have these different characteristics about compassion and pride. They have different characteristics around, whether they are suspicious or questioning. They have identities and they have relationships, relational approaches that may be close or loose, but the civic and social clubs, the organizations and community groups that are maybe your supporters, maybe your donors, but maybe not be. They're traditional groups, this audience, like your Rotaries and your fraternal organizations and your civic groups. They're your more recent developed ones on social media or communities of intention. And they cover a lot of different ground. If they have volunteers, if they have fundraising, if they have some sort of an external facing mission. It might be heritage, local history, GLBT, immigration, new residents, arts and culture, environment. We have to take a look at what these audiences, how these audiences are wired for their mission, vision, and values to see where our points of intersection are. Because these are amazing people who are not necessarily doing it at the library. The business side of things is a key audience in your messaging environment for 17 different reasons. One of them is, of course, direct services to the business communities and the different types of businesses, whether they're established or retail, service, manufacturing, consulting, nonprofit businesses. Who are they? The biggest employers, the Main Streets, the Convention and Visitors Bureau, the folks who are concerned about growth, and well, retail is important, don't get me wrong, but the most important one, whenever you're talking about the tax base, is the real estate agents. I want you to understand a little bit more about how these audiences are wired to listen about the library, because there is a common purpose for a livable, prosperous community here that goes beyond having good databases like EBSCO, Gale, or ProQuest. Another audience that's absolutely critical for you folks is your audience of politicians and elected officials. And I'm talking local, state, and federal. I'm talking folks who've been former elected officials. The idea that they have a constituency of their own. They have reasons that they've run. They have a party platform. We need to spend some time looking at this audience as a group for us to spend some time talking to in a particular way that, again, isn't about service to them. It's about where is our shared identity or our common vision or our shared mission for our communities. And then another audience that we need to spend, the 7 key audiences that we need to spend some time on, is the social networks and the traditional media. Some of you, depending on where you are in Utah, actually have fairly well-defined media markets, and I'm a little jealous of that living in suburban Chicago, where you actually know your ABC, NBC, and Fox affiliates. In other places, the social media side of things, or radio and TV, radio, I should say, not TV, is a little bit, well, I mean, you might not even have a newspaper anymore. The library's newsletter might be the only thing that's produced in that community. But I want to talk to you about the audience of, well, there's traditional media, and then there's the networks, the networkers. And there's a kind of audience that I think is very important whenever we're talking about the authority of the library or our funding or any kind of political change, and that's an audience of gossips in town, the people who talk. We need to understand where they are in relation to us, relational supporters, ideological supporters of what we do, aversionary supporters potentially. We have to understand where these gossips and these folks, we're going to call them networkers or connectors, as if we're reading Malcolm Gladwell. But these networkers and connectors and gossips, where they're at with their belief or their questions or their suspicions. Let's spend a little more time developing these things. Because what we want to come out of this session with, and I want to go with the coaching calls with you, is how do we analyze your own town, your own county, in order to understand who we need to talk to, contacting these leaders of these organizations, these key stakeholders in those stakeholder groups, and having the face-to-face meetings, and to take note of what we're looking to, what do they say when we talk with them, not to them. Because you've got some big ideas that you want to see advanced in your community through your library. You've got some big ideas for your library. We need to be prepared with this as more than a marketing exercise. This is a way to co-create a future that has new funding or authority for the library in it to act. One bit of coaching ahead of time on this is that whenever you go off and have these kind of conversations with leaders across those 7 different areas of society, regardless of how those audiences are disposed to you and to your work, you're going to want to capture a couple of key elements of your conversations. And I want to make sure you hear this before you hear it again from me in another future training. The bright spots that come up in that conversation. Oh, we love what the library's doing. You know, it's such a great thing that we have this kind of existing partnership. Isn't it wonderful that we are able to do things together at scale? The hot spots, which is like, oof, stuff's kind of rough right now in our town. Things are a little disrupted. The library's taking a couple shots right now with the books and the collections. Things are a little tough economically or socially, or politically too, if I can say that. The blue skies that you get in a conversation like that, where folks are like, well, it's nice to talk to the library. Let me talk about me for a while. Let's talk about us eventually. The blue skies are when people wander around for a little while and describe to you things that, oh, what if, like, we should, we could, somebody should. The what ifs that come up in those conversations are a little bit more tactical. Oh, you know, what if we do work on co-creating something together? What if we were to put a small amount of smart tax money to work for those people we care about, or this place we call home? And then the last thing that we always want to pay attention to in any of these audience conversations is who else should I be talking to within or outside of this audience? These are questions we're going to come back to as we go further into this training program together, especially around coalition building, around talking to elected officials, and talking with more. There's another session on basically talking to the people who run the place. All right, let's unpack this a little bit more and see what our audience segmentation can look like. What we start from when we know who we're talking to is, well, we start with what we know. But when we are looking to go outside of our comfort zone, or to begin to engage an audience that we don't know already, when we are trying to figure out how do we approach someone, either who runs an organization, staffs an agency, is a key stakeholder in a stakeholder group, when we're looking to talk to somebody who's in power in some ways, politically, socially, civically, or when we're looking to approach someone who's a grant maker or a philanthropist or a major donor, we have to use some tools to help us, first off, understand ourselves in relation to that audience. We have to make some assumptions about why we will go talk to them based on what they want to talk about and who they are. It's very important for you before you leave the building, and I'm going to make you leave the building, but before you leave the building, to review say, if it's an organization, the mission, vision, and values of that organization. If it's a politician or a grant maker or a donor, what's their mission, vision, and values as individuals? Or the family foundation that they represent, the organization that they staff, and to make some assumptions about why they could talk to you and what they would like to talk about, rather than what's on your agenda exclusively. We always use a tool for this audience segmentation and this audience message development. It's called the message box exercise. It has a couple of key elements to it, and you'll have a little bit more in your packet about this. But the Tully message box, Tully, you can look it up too. There's a lot of good resources out there. Is a 4-quadrant approach to asking what our assumptions are across those 7 different areas of society for a particular group. So we can segment. We can start a top level message with educational stakeholders, for example, or social welfare and religious stakeholders, civic and social partners, or we can use this same exercise to say we want to go talk to the United Way of Greater Eastern, Western, Southern, or Northern Utah. What do we say about ourselves in relation to that group or that segment of the audience? What do they say about themselves as that stakeholder group? What do we say about them specifically about educational stakeholders, or say the United Way of Western Utah? What do they say about us? Is a very perilous question to ask sometimes. These 4 questions are moments of reflection that are based on truly our assumptions. We've never had a substantial conversation before with that audience. We've never engaged them in substantial ways. We know of them, they may know of us. How do we make a bold assumption about what we want to talk about in relation to who they are, what they believe, what their lenses are? I'm going to take one as an example here across this Tully message box, these 4 quadrants. This is a real life example from a library that we have been working with over the years. The Kitsap Regional Library, they did us a favor and they lent us their message box and some of their other plans. And it's an interesting library, and I chose that one for this Utah conversation because it's rural and urban. Kitsap is across Puget Sound from Seattle. So aside from the fact that it's a rainforest and you guys are a desert, very similar characteristics across different populations. They got some urban centers. They have some very rural defined communities. Military are fairly significant in some pockets there. It has a terroir that I think might be similar enough to not get in your way for this exercise. But you're going to have to do this exercise yourself, and that's what we've got the worksheets for you about. Kitsap Regional Library did a message box around social welfare and religious groups where they said, okay, we have been accidentally working with these folks for a long time. What happens when we want to work with this audience intentionally, to communicate with this audience intentionally about our shared vision, our common mission, our aligned value system? When we start talking with them about our funding, because they were going to go out and ask for new funding in Kitsap, and they won, which is great. What are our assumptions talking to these social welfare groups? And so they did this message box and said, what do we say about ourselves in relation to social welfare and religious groups? What do they say about themselves as social welfare and religious groups? What do we say about them? And then the most terrifying one, which is what they say about us. So what we say about ourselves is, we care, we provide things, we help, we equal access, low barriers, no judgment. What they say about themselves is noble stuff. We believe that they think of themselves nobly. They help people, they provide services, they need more volunteers, they're welcoming. What we say about them on the lower left-hand side, well, we are making some assumptions about why we want to go talk to them, about the work that we're doing that's together, and the funding that we're trying to accomplish, the funding needs that we have in relation to them as an audience. What we say about them is that they can't provide they provide resources that we as the library cannot. They'll help anyone, that's great. They are also about the community like we are. They'll go out of their way to help people. And what they say about us, again, which is perilous, we provide resources that they can't. We're open to everyone. They think that we're kind and helpful. One-on-one help with job searches, which is a big area of interest for KRL. This provides some framework where if you're not sure, at least it gives you enough to go on that you can go into a meeting and say, we think about you in the lower left as someone who provides resources that the library cannot. We think about you as someone who can help. You're all about the community. You go out of your way to help people. We think that you are, upper right-hand side of things, what they say about themselves. We think that you are there to help people. You provide the services that no one else can do. We assume that you need some more volunteers. What we know about ourselves here at the library is that we provide these certain things to the same people that you serve, and we're not sure how you feel about us right now, lower right-hand side. We think that we're doing something that you can't do, but we want to make sure that we're not being duplicative, and that we would like to be in a position to help in particular ways to your constituencies. It's a fascinating exercise because it does dredge up for you what your core assumptions are about them, but it also steels you in the face of maybe uncertainty when you're going into a conversation that you're unfamiliar with. The other aspect of things that we want everyone to develop when it comes to talking with a new audience is what's called a 2793 message. It is a classic elevator speech, but really we want you to develop it not because you're going to accidentally be on the elevator with somebody. That barely ever happens. In fact, in some of your towns, there aren't any elevators. 27 words, 9 seconds, 3 things to tell them, just to get yourself set up for what's the core reason that you want to talk to them. It forms a very nice opening paragraph for an email when you want to reach out to somebody who runs an organization, staffs an agency, or is a key stakeholder in a stakeholder group. I'm going to show you some real life examples about that right now. Here's some ways, and you're going to have the worksheets, and we're going to have the coaching calls, and there's the opportunity for you to work on this audience segmentation and message development with us together. Here's how it goes. The educational stakeholders side of things, this is again is Kitsap. We went through with them together, the message box, and discovered why we want to talk to them. The education stakeholders are natural partners. We work together. When we work together, there's a lot of leverage. We together can best address challenges for our kids, but sometimes it's difficult because of time or barriers. Sometimes they're difficult. These educational stakeholders are difficult to work with because their follow through is poor, and they may perceive the public library as a threat because before school, after school, out of school is not necessarily exclusive territory for the public library. So you think about the short message. We are a partner with parents and teachers to prepare children for school and extend the school day through independent learning and discovery. We help extend your budgets. We do after school. And we want to be collaborative. That's our hopes. And that the reason to contact them is then to talk about the 2 or 3 biggest problems, 2 or 3 biggest barriers that we think that we can solve together through a partnership. The audience is highly segmentable here as an educational group of stakeholders. And it has to be a conversation that the audience wants to have with you in their own identity. The fact that we've got some things that are big problem solvers for education, they're different with social welfare. Here's the 27. Here's the message box. You boil it down to sugar for Kitsap. It was what do we want to talk to them about? Well, they're passionate. They reach a lot of people. They're a positive force. They fill in gaps. We have gratitude to them. But when we go into this meeting, this is an internal prep document, folks. We're not sending this as an email to them. They do turn people away. They're too narrow. They have a very challenging clientele. They don't interact necessarily. We do pick up their problems sometimes. Their reach is limited. But the 2793 here, how do we want to approach them? Our library connects with local social service providers to break down barriers, improve the quality of life, broaden opportunities of the city's most vulnerable citizens. We are a social leveler. We are a vehicle for furthering the mission of that social welfare group. We're essential to their success, and we're trying to be partners. Our big question, again, is around shortfalls and barriers for the populations we both care about. We want to approach based on their identity as an audience, again, not as an audience of social welfare and religious organizations, and not with a story we're trying to tell about everything else that we do at the library. Civic organizations, same thing. there's a message box that's boiled down to sugar, that's positive, mission driven. They take on many projects. Our friends of the library are peers of theirs because they're a civic organization. But, and this is kind of a negative situation, they don't have a good idea of who we are. They're siloed. They're convinced of their own importance. So these are some things that we have to overcome. And again, what's our 2793? They're strong partners, build strong communities. Our funding are focused on building collaborative resources. The three things that we want to talk about are resources that support their mission, spaces they can use, aligned in increasing community growth, and then our big question that we want to address, the emerging opportunities for that organization after COVID. What are significant challenges that they're trying to address for people or around their cause, and how do our goals overlap? This is very specific to that one community. And yet, there are places that are very similar to yours as well, from a discipline perspective. The elements that we need to talk about with all of our audiences in order to capture believers, questioners, and suspicious voters alike, again, are what happens if the funding flows or we're empowered to do it, and what happens if we are underfunded or not empowered to do it. The reason being, to bring that up, the agendas that we're trying to advance may be ours, they may be not our own. When I say that, one of the agendas that we are looking to advance sometimes is our city council's agenda or our county commission's agenda. And that's fine because we are certainly a unit of government, and our county commission, our city council, our elected officials have their own agendas that we may, well, if we consider them an audience, we may need to adapt the vocabulary that we use about our services to fit their particular agendas that they're trying to drive. Most elected officials are focused on interesting places to live and thriving places to live and prosperous places to live. How do we respect our audience of elected officials and politicians and talk about our activities in a way that they can listen to around interesting, especially about our programming, around thriving, around our collections and our services, and prosperous around the ways that we help people find either work or self-direction or employment, I should say, entrepreneurship opportunities. And then you've got a group of elected officials who are looking to avoid things like duplicative services and inefficiencies, where we have to be more willing to talk to those politicians about about how we're accomplishing those goals, perhaps than we've been comfortable to in the past. But let me come back to your own agenda. What do you want? And I want to help you think through for a moment here about the audience, about positioning your wants in relation to what the audience also wants. Programs, collection services, staff, and facilities are the big five for any library leader. What do you want? There's a dollar amount potentially attached to any of these five or all of these five together. What do you want? What we want to start with when we're doing this kind of work, first and foremost, is a conversation about where your values, vision, and mission either overlap or align with those different stakeholder audiences that we've been discussing. It's very important for us to start it not with the strategic plan for the library alone, but with the experience of the lived experience, the lived mission, vision, and values of the people who work at the library, because you're the ones carrying the message yourselves out to those different audiences. I always ask 5 questions of a staff group whenever we're working together. When it comes to talking to audiences and constituencies about your funding, your authority to act, about co-creating a future in an advocacy framework. The questions here truly are personal questions, but they help in a tremendous way because the conversations with folks who run organizations, staff agencies, and our key stakeholders and stakeholder groups are happening human to human. Why do you work in that library? What are your personal values about librarianship or library work? How's your work and expression of those values? What problems do you enjoy trying to solve in the community? And what problems do you enjoy trying to solve for individual patrons? Are fundamentally the workforce's values, visions, and missions. And I want people to be aware of their own feelings, their own postures, their own lenses before we go out and start talking to other audiences, before we start deeply segmenting the messaging. I always want to ask also, whenever we start a process around audience segmentation, to get as close to the relational supporters as we can. So I always ask the staff and the board, what do you belong to? Where do you live? Where do you spend your time? Because the early victories, the early successes, the early comfort in any of these kinds of projects is so helpful. I'd rather have fewer message boxes, the speculative, making the assumptions. I'd rather have fewer assumptions made and more relational discussions happening. Who do you know who knows everybody, and who are we missing are two really key questions as well. One is the who do you know who knows everybody is really that conversation around the gossips and the networkers that I mentioned earlier. But the who are we missing question. When we look at the audiences, we tend to be looking at audiences of existing organizations, established agencies, legacy stakeholder groups, or we're looking at audiences that might be newer and emerging, but still vocal and enfranchised. For the library's communications, for the library's advocacy to have legitimacy, we need to be doing things with otherwise, well, folks who are not necessarily in the main, folks who are not necessarily in the majority, the disempowered, perhaps. And that group has just as much dignity. That group has just as much opportunity to participate in what the library is looking to do as any of these mainstream established organizations do as well. Again, I want to come back around to plan A, plan B. What happens if we are empowered or funded? What happens if we are underfunded or disempowered when it comes to our community, so that we can effectively communicate with our audiences about the reality of things. And I want to take you through what that looks like. The messaging around Plan A and Plan B for a particular audience, of course, is segmented by the type of stakeholder group they are: education, social welfare, religious, civic and social, governmental, political, media, etc. It's segmented by whether or not they're believers, or I'm sorry, it anticipates whether they're believers, questioners, or suspicious voters. It has a lens of compassion to it and pride. It has some data behind it as well. The reason that I want to talk about the Plan A, Plan B when we're doing any kind of work to anticipate audience segmentation is, again, to that what activates somebody around their ideas and their ideals. Is our value system being realized? Is our identity being advanced? Or is our value system being in some ways impinged or offended? Or is our identity being attacked is a very strong word, but is our identity being violated by a lack of resources, a lack of ability to solve problems, a lack of ability to meet people where they're at? So when we talk about Plan A and Plan B in our message development exercises for different audiences, we use two phrases. Plan A, we are asking for this funding so that we can do X, Y, and Z for a particular population, for a particular place that we call home, so that we can. If we don't receive the funding, Plan B says it means we won't or can't do those things that we both believe in, whether we both hope for, whether we're both concerned about. It's interesting. It's fairly straightforward. There's a feature to what the library has that addresses a particular impact or part of the community. and that there's a partner audience, there's an organizational audience, there's a stakeholder group that you want to write this thing for. And then you do some cadence around it of so that we can, and it means we won't. And again, this is in your workshop packet. We'd like to work through this with you on the coaching calls and one-on-one as well. But this is what it looks like from Palatine, Illinois. They were very nice to us. They let us use their resources. The audience segmentation here is for educational stakeholders. If the funding happens, in this case, if the referendum passes, so that they can. There's a feature on the left-hand side, and there's a benefit on the right-hand side. The feature is to increase study rooms and collaborative spaces, noise reduction, energy efficiencies, revamped tween spaces, dedicated school spaces, et cetera, so that we can benefit, impact, improve, support, treat better, enable. Providing these spaces does certain things. It accommodates, it's welcoming, it's safe, it supports. It's a fascinating way to do audience segmentation because this is about folks who care about education. This is not a universal statement for the library to social welfare, to governmental partners, to business leaders. This is their plan B for education stakeholders, though. If they don't get the funding, because the idea is defeated, it's not funded, they don't get the grant. If the referendum fails, in this case with Palatine, those features are going to be missing. The features of the library might be services, staffing, programs, collections, the built environment, the big five for libraries. It means that they won't, or they can't do certain things for the people and the place that those educational stakeholders believe in. This is where our common cause lies. This is where our common concern truly is. Audience segmentation is not saying, here are parents, here are seniors, here are people who are doing genealogy. But those are totally possible little audience segmentations, don't get me wrong. But in the main, these stakeholder groups, plan A, so that we can be on a common cause with you. Our shared identity, our relationship together. And plan B, let's make sure that we all understand together and define together what will be missing if the library is not empowered to do it. All right. Coming around the horn, folks. You've been with me for a little while today, and I really appreciate it. What we're not talking about, and we have not talked about at all, is that marketing and messaging and audience segmentation around user versus non-user. I'm not interested in that right now. Most every other seminar that you've ever attended is about building more users. That's great. What we're talking about here is building support. However, there are two universes in terms of audience segmentation. There are two universes. There are users and there are non-users. And I can't get through an audience segmentation conversation without talking about users and non-users at the top level. When you're talking to an audience of users, you start your conversation with the phrase, as you know, even if they don't know. They are part of a tribe. You can tell them, as you know, with the high school right around the corner at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, this place fills up, the Wi-Fi goes down, everybody who's over to the age of 30 flees. As you know, we're the only place in town that does X and Y and Z for these kids. As you know, even if they don't, because it brings them in, it addresses them as an audience fundamentally that is of us. And then the non-user audience, the folks the way I like to do top level messaging to non-users, if that's our only available segmentation, is, as you can imagine, because if they're capable of imagining what you're describing, then you've got yourself a good conversation that goes a lot farther. If they're incapable of imagining it, you've just saved yourself a lot of time. As you can imagine, with a high school right around the corner, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, this place fills up. The Wi-Fi goes down. Everybody who's over the age of 30 flees. As you can imagine, this is the only place in town that does X and Y and Z for those kids. As you can imagine, without the resources that are going to come from this request, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, that sparking that imagination, sparking that identity, bringing us all together in one place like that, it's really key. Talking about Plan A and Plan B with equal measure engages believers. They love it. The questioners have their questions answered about whether the money's going to go and who's going to spend the money. And the suspicious people know what it means when you can't. And audience segmentation here, constituencies, understanding who you're talking to, having an understanding that the institutional reputation is important, where the money's going to go. But the who of who's going to spend my money, that question is unspoken very, very, very frequently, unspoken. And yet, let's talk about the integrity of the people who work there and the image of them as being competent, professional deliverers of that shared value system, that aligned mission and that common vision. All right, this is where we're gonna wrap up here. I've got another segment for you in the worksheets or in the packet that we're doing. I want to share with you 5 longer form things. I'm not going to read them to you now, but I want to make sure that you go and look at them, either on pause here, feel free to read off the screen, or go grab the what do you call it? The little workbook. Yeah, a little workbook. There's 5 things I want to talk about in that, with a little bit more understanding around audiences, around constituencies, and around the way that people are wired. What we've learned over the last 10 years doing this work specifically around political money for libraries, political funding for libraries, and the 5 lessons around nostalgia being a key driver of support, that the image of the librarian that I've been talking about is truly powerful and impactful, that the constituents that you have right now are mainly consumers and they're not mainly users of the library, even your power users, and that marketing matters a great deal. Otherwise, all you're doing is making plans for yourself that sit on your shelf, and that any problems that you're having right now need to be engaged very actively. Otherwise, in a dialogue around ideas and ideals, if you don't show up authentically, well, it's in the worksheets. We'll talk about this in our coaching calls, which is where we want to go to next. The next round of coaching calls, team, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation today. We're focusing on this understanding constituents and audiences conversation on October 25th at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. We are available here at EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute for one-on-one calls at any point, either on this topic, other topics, or things that are bothering you. But the coaching call in particular around this one, the State Library will be sending out the information about how to register for it, as well as the readings. That was the word I was trying to figure out before, readings, and the worksheets as well. So here's my contact information, and I look forward to seeing you on the 25th and the next opportunity that we have to speak together soon. Be well.